Development of the nervous system for anatomy and physiology. So when I teach this stuff, I like to start from the very beginning. So try to go back as far as we can. So for that, we would then ask the question, why do animals even have a nervous system? So what do you think the answer to that is?
To be able to feel when they're out in the wild,
Yep,
maybe.
exactly. Anything else?
Kind of like the response system to be able to respond to things,
Yeah,
maybe.
you're exactly right. So the two reasons that I can simplify it the most are to control their bodies. So your central nervous system, your brain does that, and then your brain is connected to the organs and stuff in your body through your peripheral nervous system, and to detect and respond to your environment. So our special senses, our eyes are connected directly to nerves which go to our brain. Our sense of smell does this, our sense of touch does this. So all of those things. But of those, which would you guess evolved first? The top ability or the bottom ability?
Oh boy, that's a good one. I would say their environment because it's survival.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. So I think to me, it's almost certain that the first one evolved first, the ability to control the organism. Now, as important as responding to the environment is, there are a lot of organisms on our planet, some of the most primitive, like jellyfish and animals like that. They don't even have a central nervous system or any special senses. They can't taste, they can't see anything. The only thing they're really capable of doing is controlling their own movement, controlling their own bodies. So that's the very first thing on there.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So if we take like the eye, for example, that's an organ that helps us detect our environment. That has evolved perhaps 40 different times in the animal kingdom, and there's a huge diversity in eyes. They're the way they interact. I'm actually reading a book right now that the last chapter was all about how eyes evolved. It's a really interesting book. So nature just finds its way to work all kinds of these things out. So all of these animals are they're really primitive types of animals. So on the top left we have the jellyfish. Some jellyfish do have eyes, but quite a lot don't. But they don't have a central nervous system like we think. Instead, we can't see it, but sort of all throughout their body is like a meshwork of nerves. And all they're really capable of doing is allowing the animal to move around, right? Jellyfish don't have any blood. They don't really have a nervous system like we think of. They don't have any organs. Basically, they just drift around and eat whatever comes their way. In the top middle, that's a coral reef. A coral reef is made of tens of thousands of individual animals called a polyp. And the bottom middle, that's a picture of what a polyp is. It's kind of like a really tiny sea anemone. So they don't really have special organs. They're just kind of like a body with sort of what we would think of like a digestive system, and that's it. The top right, that's called a hydra. The bottom right, these are sea sponges, and then the bottom left, that's a sea anemone. So these are organisms that can't really see or do any of these special things, but they just have control over their own bodies. So now we'll just shift into more like human anatomy and physiology. The development of our nervous system in embryology shows the relationship to these really ancient beginnings, right? So we can kind of trace how the fact that the nervous system forms in us in these discrete stages is evidence of all that. So our nervous system develops out of an external, what's called a germ layer that all animals have. All animals have 3 of these, except for some of the animals we just looked at, they have 2. And rather than forming all at once, the nervous system forms in multiple stages, with the spinal cord forming first and then the brain. Okay, so the actual development of it. The very first step in the formation of the nervous system is what we call neurulation. And this is where the spinal cord is basically formed. And it occurs between weeks 3 through 4. So it happens fairly early on. The entire nervous system arises from a thin layer of cells called the ectoderm. All bilateral animals, which is animals that have a right and a left side, they have three of these germ layers. The endoderm is on the inside, the mesoderm is in the middle, and then the ectoderm. The ectoderm forms our skin, and then it forms the nervous system. The mesoderm forms basically all of our organs and our skeletal system, and the endoderm just forms like the inner linings of our body cavities. So at one point after fertilization, you're only one cell big, right? So what type of cell is that when you're only one cell big? What would you say?
Oh my gosh, it's in the tip of my tongue and I'm forgetting. I feel like I'm in trivia crowd. Honestly, I lost it.
So that would just be like a stem cell, right?
Sure.
So
yep.
Today, or at birth, we don't even have to look at adulthood, but at birth, a human has brain tissue, skin tissue, muscle tissue. So the cells have turned into various different types. But when does that start to happen? Because there was a point where you were 100 cells big, 1,000 cells big. Are there any brain cells when you're 10,000 cells big, or does it take longer than that? When we look at the stages of development, on the far left, when you're about 128 cells big, you form a hollow ball called a blastocele. And then what begins to happen right before implantation is, or actually this is basically right during implantation, you start to, if we can see that the ball is starting to turn in on itself and make a cavity. That thing called the blastopore is what I'm talking about. That actually becomes the anus in your digestive system. So for a while, you're nothing but an anus with some cells around it. And then if we look, this is where the three layers that I was talking about come from. The innermost, the endoderm, that forms the inner lining of your digestive system. The mesoderm, which is colored kind of reddish, that becomes your skeletal system, your muscles, all your other organs. And then this ectoderm, the blue outermost, this is where the nervous system and skin are going to come from.
Oh, sure.
All right. So this outer layer, the ectoderm, there's a long, narrow portion of it starts to fold inward on itself, and then that forms what's called the neural tube. And this tube eventually develops into the spinal cord. An important component in all of this that regulates it is folic acid. So do you remember, was it ever recommended to you to take folic acid when you were carrying any of your children?
Not during the first one, but that was 16 years ago. But
sure.
With Elijah, about 9 years ago, they started telling me to start taking folic acid.
Yep. And do you know why that is? Did they explain to you a condition that can occur if you don't have enough?
No, they just would say, concentrate on folic acid, DHA, and just it's supposed to help genetics is basically what they told me.
Right. So folic acid, if you have a deficiency in it, it can lead to spina bifida. And have you heard of what that is before?
Yeah, yep.
It's basically, so we look at the neural tube, it starts to fold inward on itself, but it has to fold inward and then close up the whole length of the spine. And spina bifida is where at the very bottom end usually it doesn't close all the way. So this leads to like a pocket. It'll be like a skin-covered pocket outside the spine where spinal fluid and things are there. And that's incredibly dangerous because it means that the spinal cord, all that's separating it from the environment is basically a layer of skin, and that's it. So they can actually repair spina bifida inside the womb. You can have that surgery on your child before it's ever born. And it's fairly simple. They basically just stitch it closed.
Wow.
So here are, again, the three germ layers. This is really simplified. Endoderm in yellow, mesoderm in red. At the very top, that's kind of the neural tube. So you can see the ectoderm has folded in on itself and created a tube.
Yep.
We can see a little bit more detail on the left-hand side. So the pinkish reddish layer, it's going to pull down, and then that's what forms this tube. And then there are a few extra things, but that's basically the spinal cord. The neural tube, it becomes that. And on the right side, this is after after it forms, maybe towards the beginning of week 4 or something like that. And because it folded inward on itself, there's a hole through the middle, the central canal. That central canal is present your entire life. It's very, very narrow once you're born and into adulthood and everything, but it is there, and it's a remnant of our development in the womb. Okay. In the late stages of neurulation, the superior portion, superior means topmost, of the neural tube starts to divide even more rapidly, and then it becomes these proto-brain structures, right? So the neural tube, we're done with that. It becomes a spinal cord. It's a fairly simple structure, but the brain is much more complicated. So what's called the mesencephalon, which means middle brain, is the first region of the brain to develop. And the neurons in your midbrain are involved in vision, hearing, motor control, keeping yourself awake, your circadian rhythms, arousal, and by arousal we mean like alertness, and body temperature regulation. So that's it right there in pink, the mesencephalon. It basically just starts off as a little bulge, and then gradually it develops fairly complicated into some structures in our brain. And it's this other diagram here. This would be towards the end of week 4. There's your mesencephalon, and then we have an actual picture of an embryo between 8 and 9 weeks. You can see the cerebral hemisphere on top. That's the main part of the brain. You can see it's not enclosed in the skull yet. Just behind, or we could also say underneath that, there's the mesencephalon, that little bulge right there. Above the mesencephalon is what we call the prosencephalon, or the forebrain. This becomes 2 different structures, the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon becomes your cerebrum. It's like when you think of brain, you think of like that big wrinkly part on top with 2 halves to it, 2 hemispheres. That's your cerebrum, right? All mammals have a cerebrum. It's where a lot of our sensory things and information processing goes on. The diencephalon becomes the thalamus and hypothalamus, plus a couple other structures. And we'll talk a little bit more about the hypothalamus at the very end here. So it's the largest protruding region here. The eye develops from this as well. It starts off basically as just a black dot. And then we can see that here, the telencephalon in front. And what says the cerebral hemisphere is part of it there, the telencephalon, and then the diencephalon sort of below that. And then behind all of those structures is what we call the rhombencephalon, which is the hindbrain. And that becomes part of your what's called your brainstem, the pons and the medulla oblongata, but also your cerebellum, which is your little brain. That's the portion underneath of the main cerebrum, and that's involved in coordination. In humans, we have a very large cerebellum, and humans are very good at sensing their environment around them. It seems like a very easy trick, but if I tell you to close your eyes and touch your nose, that's actually a pretty remarkable skill that we have. It seems simple to us, but it's because we just have evolved that ability. These other things, which are part of your brainstem, your pons contains neurons that are involved in a huge variety of things, including sleep, breathing, swallowing, bladder control, hearing, balance, taste, eye movement, facial expression, facial sensations, and even your posture. Your medulla oblongata regulates breathing, respiratory reflexes. So while you're asleep, it regulates, your breathing and your heart rate and your blood pressure as well. So these parts are kind of like our life support system, whereas other parts of the brain are just involved in more like complex things. There's famously a story about a chicken that was beheaded on the farm, but the chicken didn't die because the chicken had just the top portion of its brain decapitated, the cerebrum. Meanwhile, its brainstem was still there. Well, look at all these things that are involved in the brainstem: sleep, respiration, breathing, heart rate. So that chicken actually lived for, I think, 1.5 years, and they toured the country with it just showing people like, yeah, it's got no head, but it walks around. And
I think I heard about this. Yeah.
yeah, it's been like on Ripley's Believe It or Not and stuff like that. It was in the really early 1900s. It was a while back. So we're looking at the green region. That's the hindbrain, the rhombencephalon. It's the portion in the middle right there. And then in this picture, can't really see much to it, but it's basically right on top of where the sort of head on this embryo is. And it's everything labeled in, or colored in teal, or whatever color that is right here. So again, the big top portion, that's the cerebrum. So that's the part that the chicken had cut off. Meanwhile, all that stuff in turquoise, the brainstem was still there. All right, we're getting pretty close to the end here. One of the last parts of your brain to develop is the hypothalamus, which regulates your body temperature, among other things. If I go back here, your hypothalamus is right here. Can you see my mouse?
Yep.
Okay, good. What your hypothalamus does, part of it is, this is your pituitary gland. So your hypothalamus connects the brain and the pituitary gland. And your pituitary gland is the major gland of your endocrine system. So it's a really crucial part of our brains, but also regulates body temperature. Premature infants, consequentially, have a really hard time regulating their body temperature because when they're inside the womb, it's warm and wet, right? So they don't have to worry about regulating the temperature. But their bodies aren't necessarily ready to do that on their own. So it's one of the concerns with premature births. And then as far as after birth goes, when you're born, your brain is about 25% adult size, but the number of neurons is virtually identical. So the number of cells in a newborn's brain is the same as an adult, and it's around 100 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. Now, if you've ever seen pictures of neurons, you know that they have lots of branches coming off of them.
Yeah.
One single neuron can have as many as 200,000 connecting sites. So 200,000 times 100 billion, this is like 20 quadrillion connections our neurons can make, and that's too many. So beginning at around 24 months and continuing until your early 20s, your brain actually severs many of these connections. So instead of one neuron being connected to many thousands of other neurons, it only connects to maybe several hundred of them.
Oh, wow, okay.
The brain does this to become more efficient at transmitting information. So this is that's fine. This is what's called a slime mold. It's technically an animal, but it's like it's just this gelatinous, oozy sort of animal that just spreads out in all directions. And we have discovered something really interesting about them. I'm gonna do this so I can use my mouse. If we put them in a maze, and what we can't see here is they have food at these two locations labeled N.
Okay.
If we put the slime mold in the maze, it will rapidly divide its body out and fill up every nook and cranny, but then it detects the food, right? So the food goes from here to here. Now what this slime mold will do is it will retract all of its spindles and fibers that went into the empty crevices of this maze or whatever, and so it will only leave behind the tubes that make the shortest connection from one side where there's food to the other. So this models a little bit like what goes on during synaptic pruning. It's kind of cool. These really simple organisms have a really smart way of figuring that out. Yeah. There's a really good video on YouTube titled "Are You Smarter Than a Slime Mold?" that I really recommend watching. It's really cool.
Okay.
So this is what the density of our neurons looks like. At birth, we can see it's fairly low. But then notice how from 6 years old to 14 years old, it actually decreases. But this decreasing, it seems like a bad thing, but a waking brain uses something like 300 calories a day. So the brain has a lot of energy that it's required for it. And if we can make it as efficient as possible, that will ultimately benefit the individual.
Sure.
All right, now it's quiz time. Are you ready?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
5 questions. So
Okay.
which of these is not a function of the nervous system?
Oh my god, I feel like I'm in trivia crack.
I know, right?
Would it to move the material?
So C, or what we would call C.
C. Yes.
Yep, you're right. It doesn't do that. Our digestive system, I guess, kind of sort of does that. Our circulatory system certainly does that, but not the nervous system. So the nervous system develops from the blank layer called the blank.
B.
Nope,
Oh,
not B.
hold on. It wouldn't be the ectoderm. Oh no! I should have taken note.
I know, right? It's the ectoderm, the outermost layer called the ectoderm. You can think like your spinal cord. Your spinal cord is very close to the outside of your body, so it forms from the outermost layer.
I know. Now I see the picture.
Yeah. There's 5 of these questions. The formation of the nervous system, which we call blank, occurs during what stage of development?
B.
Yep, neurulation between weeks 3 and 4. Either 1 or 2 left. I already lost count. The first part of the brain to develop is which one?
Oh, I want to say the rambulations on the side. So, see?
C?
Yeah.
Yep, the mesencephalon. That's the first part.
I'm so visual. I keep seeing the pictures.
I know, right? Yeah, I'm like that too. And as the final question, at birth, an infant's brain is approximately blank % that of an adult.
D.
Yeah, 25%. But it has the same number of cells.